So now that you've learned about time signatures, how to read music, and all the other essential components of learning how to understand written notation, we can start talking about tempo. In this chapter, you're going to learn about beats per minute, metronome markings, a very important figure named Johann Melzel, common metronome markings, the math in tempo markings, and common tempo markings. And all this information is important so that you can understand how to better interpret and perform music the way the composer intended. So when it comes to musical tempo, the tempo of a composition dictates the speed that a piece is performed. Composers have two common options at their disposal for indicating the tempo of a piece. They can either use a specific number that relates to the beat in terms of beats per minute, in which case at the beginning of the piece they might write MM 156, and that would mean the tempo would have a steady pulse of 156 pulses per minute. Or it could be any other number too. It could be 60, could be 72. It could be any number the composer wants. Or they can use a more general marking to indicate the pacing and approximate beats per minute. And a more general marking gives more leeway to the conductor to interpret the piece however they want. So using a specific number would be more beneficial to a composer who knows exactly how fast they want a piece to be performed, and a more general marking would be good for a composer that wants to leave more interpretation up to the conductor. Some music, such as music of the Baroque period, didn't use tempo markings at all. Instead, the tempo was implied by the type of piece being performed. So they just sort of knew, based on the kind of piece it was, how fast or slow to play it. So there wasn't really a need for tempo markings. Beats per minute. The tempo of a composition can speed up and slow down based on the context of the music, but the beats per minute give performers and conductors a general idea of the pace of the composition. So you have a few options for indicating beat per minute in music. You can use a single number. If you see a number all by itself at the beginning of the piece, then it's assumed that the number dictates the tempo of the beat, which is based on the time signature. So if you see a 72, you'll know that you should have a tempo where the beat occurs 72 times per minute. You can also use a note value. So when a number is accompanied by a note value, so you might see a quarter note equals 72, it indicates that the note value should be used for the beat. So this is important in a piece that doesn't use the time signature as the tempo. Maybe you have a piece in 4/4, but the tempo marking says half note equals 72. That would indicate that the quarter notes are actually 144. They're twice as fast. So the note value specified may override the beat stipulated by the time signature, or it may reinforce it. However, in these cases, the note value always takes precedence over the time signature. So why would you have a time signature that indicates 4 beats per minute, but then count it with 2 beats per measure using half notes? In the case of a tempo where it's 72 beats per minute and the beat is the half note, that would make it really difficult for the performer to tap their foot 144 times per minute. So it's sometimes easier to conceptualize faster tempos using longer note values, even though the beat should still be interpreted as a strong beat on beat 1, a weaker beat on beat 3, an even weaker beat on 2, and the weakest beat on beat 4. Because we still want to use the implied accents for the time signature whenever possible. So MM, this is an abbreviation for Melzel's metronome. It simply indicates that the number should be used along with a metronome, which is a device that clicks the beat in a steady, uncompromising manner. The beat should never change with a metronome. Many musicians incorrectly assume that the MM stands for metronome marking. And while through history it sort of has become another way to interpret MM, the original interpretation of this MM marking was Melzel's metronome. A more common option is to use a combination of different methods. So the score may show a tempo marking such as andante or moderato, along with a suggested metronome marking in beats per minute. So maybe you'd see andante, quarter note equals 72, or moderato, quarter note equals 108. So in the image above, you see the quarter note equals 120. That's an example of a metronome marking. In that example, the quarter note is going to be performed 120 times per minute. So the beat is 120 pulses per minute. So in this example, there's a quarter note followed by the number 120. This indicates there should be 120 quarter notes per minute. Since there is a quarter note listed, it typically indicates that the quarter note in the composition is worth 1 beat. As I've mentioned, MM stands for Metzel's metronome. A metronome is a device that emits a regular ticking sound at specific tempos. The invention of the metronome made it possible to create pieces with very specific beats per minute. Beethoven happened to love the metronome. Metzel was born on August 15, 1772, and died on July 21, 1838. So, as you should know by now, instead of a note value, mm equals 120, or another value will be indicated. So they won't use a quarter note or a half note, they'll just write mm, and sometimes the equal sign isn't even there, it just says mm 120, or whatever the tempo marking happens to be. The actual metronome was invented in 1816, and as I said, Beethoven was one of the first famous classical composers to use a metronome. This next concept about common metronome markings is something that's been lost with time. When musicians learn to perform and learn how to play their instruments, they get used to learning what certain tempos feel like. And there are certain metronome markings that are not common. So you should avoid using non-standard tempo markings. As I said, musicians gain familiarity with the various standard tempo markings. Through practice, they develop the ability to play at the appropriate metronome markings, the most common ones that are used. For an example, an accomplished conductor should have the ability to conduct a piece at 92 beats per minute without the need to consult a metronome. Non-standard metronome markings do exist, but they should be avoided when a standard metronome marking suits the purposes of the composition. Common metronome markings follow a strict pattern and beats per minute increase in a predictable way. So it wouldn't make sense to have a metronome marking of 41 beats per minute. And if you're a composer or an arranger and you write a piece with a metronome marking of 41 beats per minute and you try and give that to an established conductor who was trained in a classical way, they're going to immediately look at that as you haven't been trained properly. They will see that as a weakness in your fundamental skill. Regardless of whether or not you're a good composer, the fact that you used 41 beats per minute, which is not a standard metronome marking, would set off alarm bells. And if you're entering contests or trying to win competitions, this becomes a real issue. With so many composers submitting compositions, judges often find really simple ways to eliminate the competition, whether you're talented or not. And in some cases, metronome markings that just don't make sense in a traditional way will be one example of a composer who doesn't have a foundation to compete on a professional level. And they may, it depends on the jury, but they may decide to eliminate composers based simply on whether or not they've followed true metronome numbers. So, this is probably an extremely important slide for you, but these are the true metronome numbers. You have 40, 42, 44, 46, 48, 50, 52, 54, 56, 58, 60. Notice how from 40 up until 60, the value increases by 2 ticks. Now, after 60, from 60 to 72, the values increase by 3 ticks. From 72 to 120, notice that the values increase by 4. From 120 to 144, the values increase by 6. And from 144 to 208, the values increase by 8. So the idea is that the faster the tempo is, the less important a single tick actually matters. So it's better to stick to conventional metronome markings so that conductors take your work seriously and you don't end up with a conductor who has a really solid traditional training in music who may decide not to play your piece simply because you lack some basic fundamental skills, and they may see that as a weakness. So it's important to memorize these. One way to avoid this entirely is you can use common tempo markings, and these are only a few of them. There are many, many different tempo markings you can use. But if you do this, then you can avoid the issue of having to remember very specific tempo markings, and you can just use a general tempo marking that the conductor then has the ability to be flexible with your piece. So when you use one of these tempo markings, they often describe the style of music as well. You don't have to use Italian, but the Italian tempo markings are the most commonly used in the common era of music. There are also some additional tempo markings that I've listed in the textbook. But you can see that these various tempo markings have a range of metronome markings. So largo would be performed very broadly with the notes very connected, and it'd be 40 to 60 beats per minute. Adagio is usually a slow and very stately piece. It's a piece that should unfold very easily, and it's generally from 66 to 76 beats per minute. Andante's a walking pace, a medium walking pace, not too fast, not too slow, and it's about 76 to 108 beats per minute. Allegro indicates that the piece should be very fast, played quickly, and have a bright, almost joyous feeling to it in a lot of cases. So sometimes your tempo markings, the ones that you choose, will dictate how the piece is performed as well. So it's important to research any tempo markings that you use, and if you want to go against the convention of how to interpret a tempo marking stylistically, then it's a good idea to also leave a note about how you want the piece to be interpreted and performed. So that's it for tempo.